Thank you everyone for coming out here tonight and for allowing me to speak with you today. Historians are, in one sense, professional storytellers. This is one of the biggest perks of my job, and I think the archivists here would agree with me on this. One of the biggest perks of what we do is being able to recreate stories that we piece together from documents and artifacts that people have left behind. So what I will do today is share some stories about the enslaved people who built this frontier society of western Missouri and eastern Kansas, this fault line as it was described. And I'm going to focus really on the early and mid-19th century. Now, of course, historians do more than just share stories. We're also trained to provide a framework to understand those stories. So as author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has said, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. So she's not a historian, she's a novelist and a memoir. She writes memoirs, but she's absolutely right. So that's one of the things I like to think about when I give talks, is what are the stories that I want to share? So what we'll do today is consider how enslaved people's stories help us better understand life on the Kansas-Missouri border. Now, some of this might be review for all, because I know that you are history buffs, or at least have some interest in history, but I do want to start by getting into a little bit of the historical context of this topic. And so we will have a few slides up here to kind of situate us. So the Kansas-Missouri border did not take its current shape until 1837. Previously to that time, we had a region that was populated by Native people, including Native nations like the Osage, also a few military officers, Indian agents, and as some of you might have heard of, the Choteaus and their French fur trade empire. And that was really kind of the dominant force on the border until white settlement increases. So I am going to have to kind of signal to the slide people, so that's what I'm going to do. So next slide, please. All right, so this was how the border looked after Missouri becomes a state, of course, in 1821. So you'll notice the Kansas-Missouri border there looks a little bit different than it does today. So the western border, most of it takes shape after statehood, and white settlers started building towns like Independence, Liberty, and Westport. And then we have the Platte Purchase, so next slide, please. With the Platte Purchase, Missouri added 6 more counties to the northernmost corner of its border. So it's not as pretty of a map as the previous one, but it gives you an idea of the area that we're talking about. So this is where we start to see the border take the shape that we're familiar with. In the 1830s and 1840s, the United States ramped up its effort to dispossess and remove indigenous people. This is the process that we call Indian removal. And the west side of the border was designated as part of this new Indian territory. So it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see Oklahoma down here, what's today Oklahoma, what is now Kansas, and also even up into Nebraska. So we start to then see that western side of the border take shape. Indian Territory was designed as a home in perpetuity for Native nations that had been forcibly removed from states like Ohio and Indiana. Indian Territory, though, as you know, was short-lived. With the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the land immediately west of Missouri, what had been Indian Territory, would be opened to white settlement as Kansas Territory. And the indigenous people there would be pushed out to make room for white settlers. So this gives you an idea, it's a little bit distorted, but it gives you an idea of how that border is just kind of constantly evolving as we get into the 19th century. So with the formation of Kansas Territory, we see the advent of the Bleeding Kansas period. This is a period fraught with intense strife over the issue of slavery's expansion into the West. And this was a conflict that had been brewing for decades. The Kansas-Missouri border is affected by this just as elsewhere. And pro-slavery Americans basically the way I explain it to students is pro-slavery Americans have a particular vision for how manifest destiny should look. The idea that westward expansion should look a certain way. So pro-slavery Americans want access to Western resources, and they have their own vision for how this should look. They want to expand slavery because slavery is their ticket to the American dream. Now others who are not supportive of the slave system, they envisioned manifest destiny differently. They were supporting westward expansion. They support manifest destiny as a concept, but their version of it, their kind of spin on it, is that they wanted a free West, a West that was not tainted with slave labor. That's the way they described it. So what we see happen as this crisis over slavery's expansion continues, what we see are these competing visions for what westward expansion should look like and what then life should look like on this border. Now, the 7 years between the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is in 1854, and the advent of the Civil War in 1861, this 7-year period is a period of intense turmoil, hence the name Bleeding Kansas. I always tell students you don't call something bleeding if it was peaceful. It's just not really kind of how it works. So Bleeding Kansas is fascinating. This is, there's a lot I could say about it, but in short, what happens in Kansas is these two different visions for manifest destiny clash, because voters in this new territory would determine the status of slavery. This is a principle that we call popular sovereignty. So instead of having the issue decided by people back in Washington, D.C. in the halls of Congress, the voters on the ground in Kansas will vote to decide whether it enters the Union as a free state or as a slave state. This is where the strife comes. Northerners, Southerners, Midwesterners, people from all over the United States and even from other nations flocked to Kansas, hoping that those of their same political persuasion would settle, gain the upper hand. When the time comes to vote, they would be the ones who have the majority and they would thus decide the fate of slavery. So the Kansas-Missouri border is instantly really front page news in newspapers. Across the nation, subscribers to newspapers are reading all about partisan violence. They're reading about voter fraud, various forms of political intrigue. So it's a really fascinating time in this region, but also a very violent time. Western Missourians are integral to this story. They are some of the first people to settle in Kansas, and their communities on their own side of the line, on the Missouri side, also are feeling the impact of this violence and political discord. So their destinies really hinge on the outcome. Would Kansas join its eastern sister Missouri in allowing slavery, or would it become a free state? That's at the heart of the story of Bleeding Kansas. Now this, of course, might be familiar to many of you, and this is the story that I learned as a student, but as I became more intimately acquainted with some of the details of this, I started to realize how much more interesting and complicated the story actually is. So about 15 years ago, I was an intern at the Kansas State Historical Society, which is in Topeka, and I was a college student working on a digitization project, which is a big word to say, but essentially what I was doing was selecting and digitizing primary sources to make them available. And it's a project called Territorial Kansas Online. You can actually look it up. So it's things that revolve around this period of 1854 to 1861. So I'm tasked with selecting and identifying and digitizing these sources. And as I'm reading, as a 19, 20-year-old intern, I started to really be struck by the fact that I was seeing all of these mentions of enslaved people who were already living in Kansas. So the narrative that I had heard was, well, this is all a fight over whether or not slavery should exist in Kansas. And I sat there at this desk kind of swirled away in the back of one of the storage bays, and I thought, well, I'm a little confused by this because there actually are enslaved people already living here. Why don't we know their stories? Why is that not discussed? And I also got curious about the thousands of enslaved people who were living on the Missouri side of this border. They were really barely mentioned at all in most of these sources. I had learned a lot from reading primary and secondary sources as I prepared for this project. I learned a lot about what white folks thought about slavery's expansion, but I really wanted to come basically to shift our frame of reference and to put African Americans more at the center of this story. And so that was the idea that I had as an intern. And I went on to graduate school and various things, and then decided to work on that for my dissertation, which then I turned into the book that we have here today. So for the most part, this story of slavery as an institution that's actually present on this border, that actually existed, has received little attention from scholars. There is documentation of slavery elsewhere in Missouri that is much more thorough. I'm sure you are familiar with some of that. But I really was trying to tackle just this western border, just where the heart of that bleeding Kansas conflict took place. And that story really hadn't been told thoroughly from the perspective of enslaved people. So there were a number of sources that I was able to use, but it was a challenge to locate research on this. And I tell people there was a reason there weren't a lot of books written about this before, and that's because there just aren't a lot of sources that directly come from the African American perspective. So I had to rely on a lot of things that maybe sort of tangentially or in a kind of roundabout way talked about these issues. So I'm not going to read off the whole list here, but I looked at all sorts of public records, census documents, probate inventories, all sorts of things like that. But I also tried to, as much as possible, find personal records that I could use as well. So that was much harder to come by, but there are a few published slave narratives from the border. The Civil War pension files were especially helpful, and there are also a few reminiscences that were published in newspapers and things like that. So there aren't a lot of sources that present the perspective of African Americans, but that's what I really wanted to tease out. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I argue in the book and give you some of those stories. So the next slide is a map of the counties that I focused on. I chose these counties because I wanted to try and make sure I picked places where there were some records that I could use. So I didn't go all the way down to the kind of the Arkansas border, but I tried to pick kind of the areas where you had the most settlement, most people living there in the 1840s, 1850s. So 19 counties are really what I focused on. And for today, I'm going to talk a bit more about the Missouri side than the Kansas side, since I'm in Missouri, and I know that's why you're here. All right, so there are two things that I kind of will focus on for today's talk. And so the first one is kind of one of the central points that I make in the book, and that is that we need to reconsider our framing of this issue. And I really kind of alluded to this already. But I think a lot of this conversation about slavery's expansion is often again cast as, should this happen? Should this be kind of the America that we want to be? Do we want slavery to spread westward? And what I really focus on is that slavery had already spread into the West. Okay? The major difference is that it's a small-scale system. So it's not the slavery that you might think of if you think of how it's depicted in films like 12 Years a Slave or Gone with the Wind. So I suggest in my book that we kind of reconsider our framing of how we think about this. So both in the 19th century and today, some people have posited that slavery would not be a successful labor system in the West. There are various reasons why they cite this. And there's also an argument in the early 19th century that chattel slavery was on the decline and that it would eventually be phased out. But I think what my research shows is that in fact slavery was present on this border, and it had succeeded, it had kind of dug its roots in by being a flexible, small-scale system that was really adaptable to different contexts, adaptable to slaveholders' needs and circumstances. So to give you a little bit of context here, a small-scale system means, again, not that plantation complex that we think of when we think of films like 12 Years a Slave or Gone with the Wind. So to give you an idea here, in 1850, looking just at the border counties in Missouri that I focus on, the 7 on the Missouri side of the line, enslaved people made up about 16% of the population on the border. So it's by no means a majority, but it also means that almost 1 in 5 people was considered property. So this is the kind of small-scale system that I'm talking about. So part of what made that system adaptable is its small scale. Those two things are connected, flexibility and small-scale system. So the typical enslaved person on the border did not live on a large plantation. And commonly, our definition of a plantation is having 20 or more enslaved workers. So I have a chart up here that shows how Missouri compares to other Upper South states during this period. So these statistics are not just looking at the Kansas-Missouri border, they're looking at the entirety of the state of Missouri. But this gives you an idea of how similar the population size was in terms of some of these other upper South states, such as Tennessee and Kentucky. And you can see it starts out even more similar in the 1830s. By the 1860s, we start to see a bit more of a disparity. But the total enslaved population is what's depicted here. So that's giving you a sense of one of the things that was mentioned in the introduction, this idea that this is a slaveholding culture that's being transplanted from the upper South. So a lot of the people, not all by any means, but a lot of the people who are coming to this Kansas-Missouri border are people from upper South states, like especially Kentucky and Tennessee, but also Maryland, Virginia, places like that. There are 4 characteristics of slavery on this border, and I have a slide for that as well. And here, some of y'all might be familiar with Diane Moody Burke. She's a historian who teaches at UMKC, and she's talked a lot about small-scale systems. So these are some of the things that I have identified that make a small-scale system different. These are the kind of markers, if you want to call them that. So the first of these is that in small-scale slave systems, it's quite common to have abroad marriages. This is particularly something that Dr. Burke talks about. Abroad marriages are marriages where those spouses lived on different farms. These are very common in small-scale systems. I do want to point out that these are not legal marriages. It is illegal for enslaved people to marry, but they do typically have a religious ceremony to mark their commitment as a couple. Another hallmark of small-scale systems is that enslaved people worked often in very diverse contexts, not just in agriculture, and often they had multiple skill sets. A third marker is this close contact between slaves and slaveholders. In small-scale systems, it's very common for enslaved people to work alongside their owners, to even live in the same house as their owners. So it's very uncommon then in Missouri to see, at least this part of Missouri, to see slave drivers or overseers. And another characteristic, the last here, is the popularity of slave hiring. Slave hiring is a system where owners rented out enslaved labor for a set period of time. The owners receive the income from that, typically. But slave hiring is one of the things that makes this system particularly flexible and adaptable. So now I'm going to get to the more interesting stuff, which is the stories. So I promised I would talk about stories. One story that I think speaks to how small-scale slavery functioned comes from the Santa Fe trade. When the Santa Fe Trail opened in the 1820s, towns like Independence and Westport, these are in the modern Kansas City metro, these played a crucial role in outfitting. They had everything you could need for this months-long trip across the plains. Blacksmiths, wheelwrights, saddle makers, wagon makers, grocers, tradesmen, everyone. And enslaved people were instrumental to this outfitting business. So we don't have a lot of images, unfortunately, of enslaved people, so that's why the slides are a bit text heavy. But the next slide is a picture of one of the better known residents of Westport and Independence. So this is Hiram Young. He was born in Tennessee around 1812. He was an incredibly skilled carpenter, and he actually earned some extra money on the side and was able to save up and purchase his freedom and his wife Matilda's freedom. They ended up having one daughter, and it was very important to Hiram and to Matilda that that daughter be born free. So he made sure that his wife got her freedom, because in slave systems, the status of the child follows the status of the mother. So if the mother's enslaved, the child is then enslaved. So it was very important to him and his wife that his wife be free. After purchasing his own freedom, Young moved to Liberty in Clay County, and then later moved to Independence. This is one of those Santa Fe trade towns where wagons and oxen yokes were in high demand. By the end of 1851, he had opened up his own wagon business with a free African-American man named Dan Smith. They used slave laborers, they hired them, but they also paid them wages. And so eventually some of these people were able to pay for their own freedom as well. And Young gained a reputation as one of the best carpenters in the area. There are many stories of people just sort of cooing, I guess is maybe not the word, but just sort of fawning over the amazing carpentry skills that he had. And I think his story is an example of how this border society relied on enslaved and free black labor in contexts other than agriculture. So it helps us kind of shift, again, our frame of reference. And it also talks about, it also shows the important role that African Americans played in building these frontier communities. Another marker of small-scale slavery that I mentioned was the prevalence of abroad marriages. So in a plantation context with a large slave population, it's much more feasible to find a suitable match closer to home. Such is not the case if you live in a region dominated by small-scale slavery. Small-scale slaveholding, and this is, a farm that has 2 enslaved people, okay, or 3. So if you're going to find your match, you really kind of have to look outside of your own home. So one example of this comes from a Civil War pension file, and this was one of the interesting sources that I was able to look at because people do share more intimate details when they're trying to get the government to give them money. So there's lots of interesting things that we see in these pension files. So Lucy Deering and other family members provided affidavits in these pension files to prove their relationship to a soldier in the U.S. colored troops. And in this case, we're talking about her husband, Henderson Davenport Crowbarger. And Lucy and Henderson had lived in Platte County, across the lane is how she described it, across the lane from each other in Parkville. So this is near the Kansas City airport today. After their marriage, they continued to reside separately since they had different owners. The short walk of a few hundred yards was no inconvenience, however, and as the only slave in the Deering household, Lucy did not have a private living space, so it didn't really make sense for them to try to live together. However, after Henderson was sold to George Crowbarger, who owned a farm 12 miles away, their marriage became strained. On at least one occasion, Lucy, who also took the last name Crowbarger, was allowed to take a horse and visit her husband for the weekend because rumors had circulated that he had, quote, taken up with another woman. When questioned about her attitude towards her marriage, this is one of the things that pension examiners looked at because they didn't want to give a pension to just a random person, right? You have to be able to prove that you're connected to this soldier. She really emphasized that as long as he lived, I considered him mine. That's her words. So it was an abroad marriage. This is typical of the region. It shows a few things. It shows that this bond was difficult to maintain, long distance. Many spouses discovered this. Abroad marriages also illustrate the challenges of maintaining contact with any loved one. This is to be expected, it's not a surprise. But it also illustrates how the small-scale nature of slavery can have advantages and disadvantages for young lovers like Lucy and Henderson. And sadly, I should have mentioned, Henderson did pass away. So he did die in 1864 in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So that's why she's getting a pension through her name. She's using her resources, and he's not receiving the pension directly. So another element of my argument that I'll just touch on a bit today and share some examples about is how important it was for people on this border to be mobile. So border society and the enslaved people's mobility is another theme in my book. And this was one of those threads where every time I was doing research, I was seeing mobility and movement and using the landscape. I kept seeing this coming up so many times in the sources. It's just sort of this central point that I kept coming back to. And I think it makes sense because this is a region where people of all backgrounds came from somewhere else. This is the period of settling the West. So everybody is mobile. These communities were small. We're talking about the 1840s, 1850s. These communities were small. They were distant from centers of political power and commerce. Everybody came from somewhere else, even many of them from within just a single generation. They were building frontier communities from the ground up. So for slaveholders, enslaved people simply had to be mobile. Slaveholders capitalized on slaves' mobility to fetch supplies, to conduct daily business, to run errands, all these various things, to provide services like carpentry and blacksmithing. And a couple of examples of this, the enslaved people who were owned by Zadok Martin is one example. He's one of the founders of Platte County. They worked on farms, they operated a ferry across the Missouri River, they're doing all sorts of things. A man named Tom, who was owned by John Calvin McCoy, one of the founders of Westport. He took a yoke of oxen one day. He was told, take a yoke of oxen and a plow and open up a road from the McCoy's place to the town of Westport. So this is his task for the next few weeks. These are just two examples of how slaves' mobility helped build that border economy. I found this more, and just as I was doing research, I just kept revisiting this and seeing this over and over. For enslaved people, much more importantly, the ability to move about could be a force for independence. Slaves might run away or travel in secret to visit loved ones or gain more autonomy by being hired out. So that is something I could talk about just a little bit more here in a minute. The very fact that mobility was so common meant that enslaved people here traveled a bit more freely. Frontier life demanded flexibility, and this provided an opening for enslaved people to test boundaries. So one story of this that I thought was interesting was the story of Jackson Dempsey. So Jackson Dempsey was an enslaved man owned by Thomas Johnson, who was the missionary at the Shawnee Indian Mission in Kansas City. And according to Thomas Johnson's son, Alexander, this is from his recounting of it, Jackson Dempsey was purchased and was allowed to hire himself out to work as a cook on steamboats that plied the Missouri. And while he was out in central Missouri in Howard County, he met a woman who became his wife. And she was actually purchased by Johnson and allowed to live with him at the mission. So there's a lot of opportunity for mobility if you're on a Missouri steamboat, right? In another example, we have a different story, which is the story of Willis. So Willis was an enslaved man who lived in Platte County. His owner was a woman named Sarah Hughes. One crisp winter day in 1849, Willis took some grain to the local mill and the adjacent store. While waiting for the grain to be ground, he purchased a quart of whiskey, and he spent time chatting with some of the white employees. He eventually became quite intoxicated. He left the mill at dusk. Keep in mind, this is winter. He left the mill at dusk and apparently wandered along the path for a short spell before he passed out. He was found face down in the road, stiff and nearly frozen to death. The damage to his body was severe, and he survived only a few more days. His owner, Sarah Hughes, sued the clerk and the owners of the store for damages, since it was illegal to sell slaves alcohol. Hughes won, despite an appeal, and was awarded Willis's monetary value of $900. There are some interesting components to this story. The fact that Willis was able to run errands and to manage his own time, so the part of the story before the untimely end, this speaks to the mobility of the enslaved community and also the apparent trust that Sarah Hughes placed in him. That he enjoyed drinking with white companions implies that socializing between white laborers and enslaved people was a natural occurrence. I have a court summary of some of this that I've read, and none of it suggests that that's out of the ordinary at all. And in fact, that store clerk sold liquor to slaves on many occasions. Of course, the freedoms that came from that mobility, being able to go, relax, socialize, knock back a little whiskey, that doesn't work out for poor Willis in this story, but despite his sad demise, I think there are still some things that we can learn from it. It does illustrate how mobile enslaved people could be in small-scale systems, such as this on the border. Of course, not all movement was a means of resistance. Most enslaved people on this border had come here from upper South states like Tennessee and Kentucky. This was an immigration that had separated them from their loved ones, from their support networks back home. At other times, enslaved people were sold or hired away. Bill Sims, who lived at the time in Osceola, which is closer to the border, he stated in a reminiscence that if a slaveholder, quote, got hard up for money, he would advertise and sell some slaves, like my oldest sister was sold on the block with her children, end quote. Slaves functioned as a major source of capital, so financial motivations like this were quite common. So these are examples of how enslaved people and slaveholders had different ideas about the benefits or the uses or the applicability of slaves' mobility. So it doesn't always work out in the long run, but it is by and large a society where enslaved people have more opportunities for movement than they might elsewhere. So what conclusions can we draw? What lessons can we learn? There are a few things I emphasize in my book, but one that I really want to point out is that we cannot understand the history of this region, of this border, without understanding how slavery shaped the region economically, politically, and socially. The experiences of African Americans on this border are central to understanding Western settlement, bleeding Kansas, and the coming of the Civil War. Often they are presented as objects of white discourse. What we see often is that African Americans are being talked about, but we're not really getting their stories. And so these are living, breathing, working people. Their labor was integral to the success of these communities. Another point is this, oops, yep, there we go, sorry. Okay, the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, another point that I make here when I think about the significance of this, what we can take away from this, is that this region was ground zero for conversations about American identity in the 19th century. And I think sometimes we can forget that today. But manifest destiny, slavery's expansion, the expansion of democracy, government policies that displaced Native Americans, these are all conversations that are taking place on this border. 19th century contemporaries in the United States understood the significance of affairs in Missouri and Kansas. It's on the front page of the New York Times. It's on the front page of newspapers in Atlanta and all of these other places. So as we study this period, I think we can kind of take our cue from these 19th century newspapers and see how understanding the importance of this region really helps us understand 19th century politics and society much better. And then the last thought that I want to share brings us back to the importance of stories. Many of these enslaved men and women lived their lives in anonymity, and for most, their stories haven't been recorded in history books or museums, but that does not negate the importance of their stories or minimize the value of their stories. We must continue to resurrect the lives of those who have been traditionally ignored or silenced. So to paraphrase one of my favorite things of all time, the Broadway musical Hamilton. So to paraphrase Hamilton, when they're gone, who remembers their name? Who keeps their flame? Who tells their story? There is still much work to be done, but I hope this project encourages additional research into the lives of these men and women, where we can recognize their integral place in our shared history as Americans. Thank you.